market program sense is that the wage subsidy is both the cheapest and has generated the largest number of jobs. What has happened in terms of our active labor market program space, because here is where we have to locate this work. Essentially, public works program have been the only game in town until 2014, when the ETI, as we call it, the wage subsidy scheme, comes into place, and it then starts taking up more and more fiscal space, as well as being a far bigger, but let's say supporting more jobs relative to public works programs. And I think that's a debate then about the choice we have in the toolbox if we are talking about active labor market programs generally, of which public works are one. We've only just introduced the wage subsidy, or the ETI, so we need to have a debate possibly about community works programs, expanded public works programs, and then the ETI. How do we compare relative to other countries? We always beat ourselves up, right? But in fact, we do really, really well. As a share of GDP, if you look at us compared to Latin American countries or other middle-income countries, we spend an incredibly high proportion of GDP. That's the line graph. In fact, the highest in the sample, even though Brazil on a PPP basis spends more than us, we spend as a share of GDP far more than Brazil in terms of active labor market programs, generally of which public works are the dominant expenditure. So just the final slide, here's some of the challenges. I think Neva, Miriam, and France, in fact, picked up on all of them. There's a constant challenge between the trade-off of providing poverty relief, skills development, improvement of livelihoods, all wrapped up in some sort of infrastructure provision. I think we have to really keep an eye on what we're trying to do with public works and what we're trying to achieve. The inability, second challenge, to convert work opportunities into sustainable long-term employment. I think that's exactly what France referred to. 100 days of employment guarantee, if it doesn't generate or doesn't convert itself into permanent employment, we need to look at that. Final 2 points, there's constant concern. The community works program has been stalled at the, if you like, at the doorstep of rampant corruption at the local level. And I think we have to be exploring that. And linked to that is you've got to set up proper monitoring and evaluation systems before you run these programs. So before we go into these new sort of post-COVID kind of expenditure patterns around public works programs, make sure we have proper M&E. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think, Prof, with that said, and let me go to Dr. Makgetha on this. With that said, the point that was made by Dr. Altman about the capacity of the state. So even if we do speak about a post-COVID-19 economy and post-COVID infrastructure program, for instance, we need to speak about the capacity of the state. Where would you say, Dr. Makgetha, are the issues when it comes to the capacity of the state or its inability?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe we should be talking rather about where do we know there is capacity. And one of the problems with infrastructure, and I do think this issue is saying we need to learn from our very big infrastructure program after 2008, 2009. So one of the problems is when you have large sums of money floating around, it becomes very tempting for people to misdirect it. But I think a lot of the times when we're talking about a lack of capacity, it's linked to the state capture issue. Having said that, I think that what we have seen works is community-based public employment schemes, and generally where you set up infrastructure systems to be more accountable. We need some very big national programs, there's no question about it. The question is, how do you ensure that there's oversight and support? But we also need much smaller scale programs, and there to me the question is, how do you decentralize control so that the people who are supposed to benefit from them are actually able to oversee the production, and that so you can do an outcomes-based approach and intervene when things are going wrong. The one other thing I would say is this: part of what happened with the 2008-2009 build program was, except for the 2010 stadiums, you know, things would be going wrong, there would be delays, there was no decisive intervention. So I think one of the key issues is to say, how do you set up a system that will ensure that when it's clear that the outputs are not where they should be, something is actually done? And then finally, one last thing, I am taking now my own extra seconds, is that part of the issue is that the public service is designed to be risk averse. It's designed to say we don't want to misspend the people's money. You know, we put in all these controls. It's not because we like bureaucracy, it's because we want to make sure that people are actually acting on mandates and not stealing the money.
But and we do. And most of exactly.
Well, I'm not saying it actually works, but I'm saying, and the argument is tended to be, therefore we need to have bright lines. We need to not put money into things that are new and different. We need to do the things we know how to do. You'll never get a transformed economy or society doing that. So I think we also need to say, if we're serious about using infrastructure to transform things, for instance, they were talking this morning about to get rid of pit toilets, you know, to improve infrastructure in townships, to support township enterprise. We need to find a way exactly that, to say, how do we take these risks without just throwing the money away? So we need to be prepared for some failures, but how do we ensure that we minimize them? And that requires much stronger risk management systems that are flexible and able to respond to the conditions as they change. So I think otherwise we end up again like we did in the last big build program, where those kinds of programs actually remain very rudimentary. Thanks.
Dr. Altman, your take on that?
Look, I agree with Neva to say where is the capacity, but the reality is that the state has lost enormous amounts of capacity. The economic cluster and cabinet have agreed that, can you hear me?
Sorry, Dr. Altman, when you say the state has lost a lot of capacity, are you basing this based on skills?
Yeah, a feature of state capture was the hollowing out of capacity across government. So we were building capacity 10 years ago, and a specific feature, corruption doesn't necessarily lead to undermining capacity, but it was a feature of state capture in South Africa, unfortunately. And you can't deliver without leadership and capacity. It is simply impossible to do. So this is why the National Planning Commission has been focused on this question of, so when we talk about leadership, governance, and capacity for delivery, what exactly do we mean? And that's why we put shoulder to the wheel around this project that we did on infrastructure delivery that focuses on procurement capacity, the capacity of the state to manage the built environment. And we need to do similar work. We didn't look at EPWP, but we need to do similar work around these other kinds of areas around refurbishment and EPWP type of arrangements. And again, yes, there has been expansion of corruption in CWP, but CWP was moving beautifully when it started. We have to ask what happened to it and how do we get it back on track. It was a fantastic program that we need to be moving again. There is nothing that is going to replace the need across government. That idea that number one priority, which cabinet says is their number one priority, is building state capacity, should actually be our number one priority at this point. We really need to get this capacity in place.
How do you build that state capacity?
Well, you on some levels, like COCTA, Back to Basics program says the top 6 in municipalities are supposed to have certain capabilities. Now, people lock into their positions, and it's very hard to dislodge people. But you could say, pick the top 25 where, or I forget what it is, but 25 to 50 municipalities where 80% of the population live. I forget what the number is, but it is possible to do that. So less than 50 municipalities where 80% of the population live, where most of the GDP is. And make sure that those municipalities have 3 years to align to the Back to Basics program. Something like that. Now that requires a certain amount of political will, because we know there's a lot of patronage in local government, right? And you have a lot of appointments, not everybody, but you've got a lot of appointments of people who just don't have the capacity to drive these infrastructure programs. 50% of capital budgets in municipalities are spent. Right? So not all of this is corruption. Some part of this is just not being able to get to it. Because why would somebody underspend? It doesn't make any sense. It's about revenue collection. It's about service delivery and know-how. So, so I would have said, give them 3 years to align to the Back to Basics program. It's not a new program, so they should already know. And then there needs to be a strong stomach. Sure. In relation to the political fallout that happens with that. And that's true right across the board. And, it's not always about having a degree as well. It's about having some track record and ability to, track record and delivery is really, I don't think it's about having a PhD or even a university degree necessarily, just to say, but that you've got some commitment and track record in delivering should even be good enough for some of these roles. Maybe not a CFO, But
Sure.
in some of these rules, that should be good enough. But we're not holding to account. So this is what we were trying to do around Eskom, PRASA, and Transnet, which are, you know, really critical to advancement of the country, is to say, if you were delivering to the NDP, what would that look like at a very granular level? How would you tie these SOEs to that performance? What would the governance look like? What sort of leadership on the board and executive management? What should that look like? Now, unfortunately, we have very, what do you call it? Constantly changing and unstable executive management and board oversight, and a lack of commitment to managing these programs and according to good governance principles. Similarly, CWP, and I'm sorry, I'm just I was a huge fan of CWP when it was brought in, because, you know, at what point do you just say, maybe people at a ward level know what they need? Let them frame what they need. And, you know, yes, you hold them to account and you may lose some of the money, but you lose some of the money anyway. But the program was expanding very fast and very effectively. And again, often it was these social services that were being delivered, that's what people wanted. Let them say what they need and what they want. You know, you don't always have to design everything from high on top. If you want to get delivery on scale, you've got to let go a little bit. Lost the bandwidth.
I can't hear Aldrin. I can't hear at all on my side. I don't know others.
Yeah, I can't hear either. I thought it was mine.
Lost you. We've lost you.
Oops.
No, still not coming.
Uh-oh.
Franz, you have to chair us now.
As the most senior member of our panel.
You are the right person to chair. Tumelo, can you do anything about this? Because we can't hear Aldrin. Tumelo, can you hear me? Is there any way we can attend to this problem?
Karin, I can't hear you.
Oh, we seem to have lost Aldrin. I'm not sure if you can be assistant or what we do.
Oh, is it Aldrin that is lost? Okay, just a moment.
While we're waiting, Prof, I like your presentation, especially making a distinction between public works, expanded public works, and community works program. Very interesting.
Thanks, Franz. Tumi's got a copy of it, and I'm happy to send it through to you. But I mean, Neva and I were chatting earlier, just saying that I think we have to decide. I mean, if we're just talking public works, forget the ETI for now, just this differentiation and how we want to split it. I mean, in Miriam's.
Arun?
I think there was a departmental switch and then corruption and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's when it was moved.
One of the questions we should be the share of expenditure between EPWP.
Are we still in a session?
Yes, Dr. Altman. Aldrin is back. Hello, Aldrin. Can you hear us? Sorry, Doctor, is one of those technical issues. Hello, Aldrin. Okay, let me try to. Okay, they're calling me. Let me just try to.
I see there's a question here from the questions here. Not sure who wants to take it while we're waiting.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Neva, you want to take that question?
On foreign investment, which one?
Foreign investment.
Are you asking me to do it?
Yes, while we're waiting so that we're not losing time.
Okay, sure. I think, I think it's a very simple thing. There's definitely potential, and we should be welcoming foreign direct investment into major infrastructure programs. And it is something that we do think about. For example, when we get Chinese investment in rail, or maybe that's a bad example, but the renewables program is another example. I think EPWP, however, is generally a publicly funded program, because there just aren't those returns,
The other point which was raised towards the end, before we lost Aldrin, was the issue of lack of capacity. In some instances, I've picked up that it is by design, so that there's leakages and so on. For example, where capacity is available and can be sourced from state enterprises. I know, for example, DBSA in building schools. And the provinces were very reluctant, because it means that there will be no opportunity to take away some of these resources. So sometimes it is by design that there's lack of capacity, not that it cannot be acquired or it cannot be sourced internally within the state.
Maybe I should utilize the opportunity to share what we are doing around the issue of this capacity, especially in the built environment, looking at the skills, the infrastructure pipeline. We are matching we are creating a database of the various skills that you need in the built environment. And we are taking, especially from our councils, those people who are registered with the councils, but who are never employed, or those students who come straight from university, and we would want to partner them with the retired engineers and all those skills in the built environment. Those people that have retired, we will group them so that they mentor the retired ones, mentor the new entrance into the environment. We're doing that because we've realized in many of the projects that are already up and running, we spend so much because either the infrastructure will not be completed on time, or if it is completed on time, the prices have grossly changed during the process of building such projects. And we're trying to then say, how do we ensure that we enhance the capacity of the young ones, the new entrants, also contributing thereby to youth development and utilizing the skills of your engineered specialists into the field, matching them with the new entrants. We think that will go a long way in addressing, especially in the built environment, the skills capacity. But with respect to governance, the School of Governance has been in operation now, and I think there are some changes and improvements that are taking place, albeit at a very slow pace, because we now need to gallop if we are to speed up in the manner we should the built environment. The soft skills, social skills also. I heard our panelists, I think it was Dr. Almat, if I'm not making a mistake, talking about opportunities brought about by the COVID-19, the social skills, the home-based cares and the like. That work is already taking place with respect to EPWP. We have currently appointed almost 23,000 EPWP workers to work with the Department of Health and as well as in the schools reopening program. We're using and utilizing EPWP workers. These are people that were recruited just in this last month. So I agree there are opportunities there. All we need is to ensure that we do not waste time in ensuring that work does take place. For me, the solutions in these programs are not only do not only lie with government. I think Comrade Franz has said this so many times, that we need that partnership. Private-public partnerships are the way to go if we are to realize any success with respect to dealing with the challenge of the high unemployment we are experiencing as a country. I'm not sure if, because I saw something that says Altrin has joined us. Am I alone in that?
I've not seen.
Deputy Minister, can you hear me?
What is that?
Okay, I'm back now. I'm back now. Okay, I don't know what I missed, but I think I'll just I'll just go ahead and ask the other question that was, and this was an issue that was raised by Dr. Makgetla, about when we speak about these EPW jobs and we speak about high impact infrastructure build projects and so forth. What type of infrastructure build projects are we speaking about here, and linking them to these job opportunities? Mr. Biden, you can go ahead and answer that question.
Thank you, Alden. Just an update. We did ask, respond to one of the questions on the foreign direct investment. And the minister also, deputy minister, addressed us on the capacity.
Thank you.
The road is one of the serious job creation infrastructure, and it does create sustainable jobs after that, because the road must be maintained one way or another. So it's a rail. The energy space, you look at in the beginning, the IPPs will create a larger volume of jobs, as well as these other forms of energy. But when it comes to maintenance, there will be a fewer jobs. Infrastructure such as ports, they have sustainable jobs. Yes, in the beginning, to expand the ports, it creates temporary jobs. But in the build-up, as the port is operating, you've got traffic, you've got volume coming in. And then you go to the local municipalities and the rural areas. There are a number of such jobs which can be sustainable. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Borat, can you answer that question, but looking at the slide that you just shared with us earlier on, where were those jobs coming from?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the challenges we find even on the data side, and again, I can share the detailed paper on this, which looks at all the active labor market programs, is that it's quite difficult to get a proper registry of allocations of expenditure. You can sort of get it by province, but it's then much, much harder to get it at sort of sectoral level or project level. And I think, it again just points to the importance. It seemed like an esoteric researcher type point, asking for impact evaluation or monitoring and evaluation type of work. That's part of how you actually can understand, well, which sectors or industries did we target, and what was the multiplier effect? Which provinces perhaps, or even broader, if you like, infrastructure needs were covered, whether it was water or rail infrastructure, whatever the case may be. And then you can do proper analytical work to look at the employment multiplier effects, the growth effects, and so on. We actually, I mean, in trying to even compile the data that I provided, was incredibly difficult to just sort of put it all together. And I mean, that would be my really request to the department, to actually make sure that you build that expertise in, or in fact, make sure that you have the systems in place to collect that kind of data. Remember, with the M&E stuff, with the monitoring and evaluation, Parliament and on Parliament and so on, it actually acts as a buffer or as a protective mechanism against corruption and leakage. So that's the other thing as well. But I agree, there's a much broader, more careful discussion that needs to be had, in which we twin our growth needs for labor-intensive, inclusive growth to the kind of infrastructure we're going to provide. I worry a lot about running to the next big supposed infrastructure project without thinking about the broader picture with respect to how this fits into an inclusive growth trajectory. Say, for example, that improves, I'm just throwing out things, improves the efficiency of ports, make sure that rail infrastructure has been built up. And that all in and of itself must fit into a broader inclusive growth strategy.
And Dr. Makgetla, how does it do that, considering, for instance, the announcement that came from the ANC's Economic Transformation Subcommittee that infrastructure would be a major focus to try and help boost the economy, but then in the absence of empirical evidence around how EPW has really assisted, it becomes really difficult if it's not industry targeted? So if you say, for instance, that we will be focusing our infrastructure in this specific industry, how do you do that when you know that when you don't know what the evidence is already?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I misunderstood. I thought what Haroon was saying is we can't really fine tune the impacts of some of these measures. Having said that, I don't think anybody is saying the EPWP doesn't contribute. I do think there's an issue that the expectations have been very high for it, and its ability to expand may be limited. Whereas if we're serious about public employment schemes, something like the community work program, which is community-based and just says, in effect says we're going to prioritize job creation, it will be subsidized by the state, and it will create some services or infrastructure for communities, but a key aim is to create jobs. It's much easier to expand that. I think Miriam also said this, that it's much easier to expand that in ways that will create jobs. And that the risk, is it okay? Yeah, that the risk of focusing on infrastructure and tying it to job creation on the construction side is you can lose track of the fact that the main way that infrastructure contributes to job creation is by providing services that support economic activity. And from that standpoint, if we're serious about inclusive growth, we need to ask much more consistently, who gets the infrastructure? How does it support the economic activity? Who benefits? And also, is it affordable? Because we've tended to say we have to have world-class infrastructure, then it's not affordable, and the businesses that need to use it are unable to afford it, so it doesn't actually help. So to me, if we're serious about job creation, we need to look at, for infrastructure, the first prize is that the infrastructure itself is sustainable and helps producers do better and helps communities engage better in the economy. And that after that, we can look at, does it create jobs? And I'm assuming Haroon wasn't saying we don't want infrastructure to, maximize employment creation and construction where possible. I think he was saying that we need to put in the kinds of oversight systems that will let us measure when we're effective or not much better. Ta.
Have we lost Aldrin again? What's happening?
Uh-oh.
Aldrin is experiencing network problems. Can Neva Maketa continue? And then I will just sort it out from my side. Thank you.
I mean, I think I had pretty much said what I wanted to say. Haroon, I don't know if you want to add anything, or Miriam.
I would ask both Frans and, well, all of you, Frans, Miriam, Neva, and the DM. I mean, it's not clear in my mind that we've twinned an inclusive growth strategy to a public works program. It seems like the two live separate lives and they sort of have an energy of their own, the public works programs. And as Neva says, I'm truly supportive of both the CWPs and the EPWPs. I just don't. Yeah. I would like to know if you were that statement, and if so, how do you build that bridge?
Yeah, Prof, I agree with you. I don't see it as it stands that it does address the element of inclusive growth. I was in another platform yesterday on this issue of inclusive growth. And I'm proposing that given the current challenges of COVID-19, many companies are going under. Instead of allowing those companies to be liquidated and jobs are lost, maybe through the support of the state or state entities, that these companies are funded and saved, but on condition that workers are allocated a stake, be 30% or whatever, and the company gets to profitability, that debt is serviced and the money is paid back. So at the end of the day, you've got all of a sudden workers who are shareholders, 30 or 40%, and that will be in perpetuity, and it change the economic effect. That's a big time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So that's a growth trajectory, right? So what you're suggesting is a model where you pick up those distressed sectors or those distressed firms, and that's how you incorporate them in some sort of public works program. And I think that's absolutely fine. At least it's linked to a growth trajectory. I just worry that we, in the sort of not random, but it's very much programmatic basis in which we're looking at infrastructure. But maybe I'm wrong.
I'm not sure that I understand if I could just come in, which is that, there's many things we need to do to strengthen the economy and create shared growth, but this particular session was about public employment programs, as I understand it. And, shared growth is partly about sharing the gains. And the reality is that in middle-income countries, particularly, and higher-income countries around the world, it's very hard to square the employment objectives that countries may have. And so that's where the state steps in. It may be through expanded state employment in some countries. It may be through public works and other kinds of opportunities, youth programs and whatever. But that is part of the shared growth story, which is that you're ensuring that there's full employment. And then the choice is to make sure that whatever people are doing is something that's useful. And in this case, like the deputy minister was referring to, placement of people to support back to school and, early child development services for children under age 4, as examples. Those fill a service delivery gap. So that is part of a shared growth story. No? I mean, that's the
Yeah. So I don't think we disagree as much as. No? Yeah. Sorry. Somebody want to come in? Hello? Sorry, I thought I saw Aldrin come in. Am I? So Miriam, my point was simply, if we have a particular vision about labor-intensive infrastructure that's tied to a growth trajectory, why not wrap the public works program in there? It's not clear to me that we've done that adequately, but as I say, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I understand the basics of what we're trying to do, in a full employment economy with public works and so on. I just don't see how, for example, there's lots of discussions about transport infrastructure, all of what needs to happen in the ports, in rails, and yet that seems somehow separated from a public works program discussion, and it's not clear to me that it should be. It's not that the public works should always and everywhere be the answer to infrastructure-led growth, but it certainly there needs to be a closer link, and I guess that was the point I was making. But sorry, I see we have our chair back.
Do we have our chair back? Okay.
Aldrin, you're back.
Aldrin is here, but the problem is the problem. He can't hear us, but we're trying to sort that out. I think the session will still continue. Then while we are sorting Aldrin, thank you.
See, can I just add? I think in terms of what everyone's saying, so that to me there's two issues here. The one is there's a really big difference between small-scale infrastructure and, as Miriam said, maintenance and so on to serve communities directly, and the large-scale bulk infrastructure that you need, for instance, when you fix the ports. And I just think we need to be clear that it's the small-scale reticulation at community level that often provides more scope for employment creation directly in the construction side. And part of what I think we need to learn, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to it, but I really think we need a proper analysis of what happened after 2008-9 with our last big build program, which is that we didn't get those small-scale programs in at the scale we had hoped. There were some, but those are the ones that keep lagging because those are actually in many ways the hardest to manage and to fund because you have communities that can't afford to pay. Whereas if you look at things like the ports, the mining companies were happy to pay for, the coal lines and the ore lines and the formal sector in general, can pay for improvements in the Durban harbor. But when you say we want to put a school in a rural area, it's quite hard to mobilize the resources, and then you also don't have capacity there to build it. So I think transformation by definition is harder than past dependency. And part of what I think is reflected in terms of what Haroon was saying is we don't actually have a program now that says how are we going to get away from that past dependency so that we can ensure the infrastructure creates jobs both through public works, but also in terms of the kinds of services that are provided and whom they are provided to. Talk. Haroon, do you want to facilitate while we wait?
You want me to facilitate? Okay, great. But I think we haven't heard from France. I'd like France to come in on this.
No, Prof, I did make a point. I agree with you. I think it's not structured to really to focus on inclusive growth. It seemed to be more about how do we create jobs in the current crisis and while dealing with the with infrastructure. And we can find a way of packaging it in such a manner that it turns around inclusive growth.
Miriam?
Prof, maybe I also need to add,
Yes.
because I stopped somewhere to say that this project of the skills I was talking about in the built environment, it is intended to ensure that, especially in your township upgrade programs, which are in the skills, in the infrastructure pipeline, those projects, we will utilize the combination of the EPWP non-skilled workers to be supervised by the new entrants, who are also supervised by your retired experienced people. That is going to help us have projects in our townships, in the rural areas, which, yes, have an economic impact in terms of road infrastructure, stormwater drainage, all those kinds of projects to be performed by EPWP workers who would be undergoing training, because by the time a project would be finished, if, say, we were paving a road and we had employed a person to pave the road for a year, by the time that project finishes, that person has the skill and can be accredited for that skill and can be employable in a company elsewhere, and can exit the EPWP to be employed elsewhere, and new entrants come into the fold. So that's really what we're trying to do, because we believe that will have an impact first on what we are currently paying in professional fees, which most of our projects we would spend a lot of money on the facilitation of a project before the actual work is done. We're trying to manage those issues, but also ensuring that we free this potential of these individuals, especially the young people, because young people who are unemployed can be a threat to the free state that we and to the very economy that is already ailing.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me now? I'm back. Apologies.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Welcome back, Adrian. Great.
Thank you so much. Apologies. And Prof, you did well. So I'll be co-hosting my talk radio show with you now.
Absolutely not. I'm the person who's most happy that you're back. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if we've touched yet on the public-private partnership when it comes to EPW and how do we do that. And Prof, let me start off with you.
So again, you know, I'm sorry to sort of come back to the story of, and maybe I can just put it a bit more bluntly. If we had, you know, a million rand available for public works programs or public employment schemes, let's call them that. If you look at the cost per job of an EPWP versus a CWP, the simple thing is that it's much cheaper to create jobs through a CWP. Once you're in that game, and that's your, if our goal is pure labor intensive growth, or let's say employment generation, then actually CWP is the way to be going, except if we think infrastructure is far more important in how we think about inclusive growth. Both of those are really important avenues to think about, because they will then modulate the kind of public-private partnerships you have. In the CWP sense, the private partnership, if you like, is really with the community, it's with NGOs and so on. Whereas in the PWP sense, it's a much larger sort of, if you like, a bit more classic sort of, whether it's with foreign investors, domestic investors, or even private construction companies. And I think for me, it really depends on which avenue we're taking. But I mean, I think the other panelists here have a much better sense of how the different models of public-private partnerships are likely to work in this domain. Thanks.
Okay, let's start off with Mr. Balin.
Thanks, Aldrin, and thanks, Abeg. Some of the public-private projects which can be in the form of public works, if you take the rail, it is on demand in terms of goods and so on. So it becomes much easier to get the private sector to be on board. As Neves indicated, same applies to ports. You can bring the private sector very easy, including roads, so to speak. You know, with a mining background, I know companies are struggling with bad roads. So they will want to have quality of roads, and they will partner with government and have these projects to roll out. And I must also indicate that for the private, it's not in the interest of the private sector to have this scourge of unemployment not to be attended to, because it makes the environment not to be conducive, because people become restless. So it's better for them to also participate and deal with the problem so that the business can operate in a normal environment. Thanks.
Do those companies then bear the cost of the labor as well, Mr. Balini?
Yes, they do. They do.
Yeah. And what would the ratio be?
It depends from project to project where the government comes in and the private sector sometimes put a bit more. You will find actually those participating in such a public and private project, they get better paid than your normal pure expanded public works. That's what I've seen in some of the projects.
Okay, and Dr. Altman, your take on that? On the public-private partnership?
In public works or in infrastructure?
In public work.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that you could have public-private partnerships, particularly if you know, one is widening out you know, how they're defined. It's just that we have to remember what they are. You know, and it's always a challenge, which is like when you have service workers working on National School Nutrition Program, as an example, what makes them different than somebody who's just employed by that program? Or a cleaner, you know, a municipal cleaner. At what point are you an EPWP worker as compared to a public service worker? And at what point are you a construction worker who's working on a project that a private sector company got a contract for, as compared to, you know, your common garden construction worker? Is always a question. So, you know, the reason that you do these programs is because, you know, that number one, you've got a service delivery gap, And secondly, in particular, you have an employment gap. If you had a choice, you would rather they were, higher paid public employees offering this service. The problem is that we have millions of unemployed, and this is a trade-off that, unions and many people struggle with, but the reality is that we have millions of people to try to draw into some kind of activity and not unlimited budgets. And that is an unfortunate reality.
Yeah. And Mr. Baleni, the argument that's always come from the unions as well is that we shouldn't even be considering EPW jobs as decent jobs. And I see Dennis George earlier on as well making a similar point.
The reality, Alfred, is that if there were better other measures to create jobs which are paying a decent salary, we would have opted for that. So I normally say, if you say no to this, bring an alternative. If there's no alternative, government can't fold its hands and allow people to suffer in perpetuity.
Deputy Minister?
Thank you, Aldrin. In fact, when EPWP was launched, the program, it was not necessarily a public employment as in the true sense of employment. It was more of the poverty alleviation program. It was targeted. It was targeting those households where there is not one person be able to pay income. It was meant to ensure that nobody just goes to bed on an empty stomach. But as time went by, it has grown because we then looked at the potential it has to build skills. And hence you find people who come in over a period of time get to be trained in these kinds of projects. In fact, if we look at what the best example for me on the EPWP or community works programs is the firefighting program. Those people in their multitudes have been trained. In as much as municipalities will have their own firefighting teams, which are small because municipalities are in themselves wouldn't be able to have that army of people. But the extent to which that program has grown and has been good, when was it Brazil had the trouble with water, with fire, they were taken en masse to go and assist. So for me, it means those are people who are truly well-trained. They are our soldiers now, the stage they are in. And they are being carried through by the Department of Environmental Affairs. So I'm saying we need to look at those projects in a manner that says we can have some level of sustainability in some, but in some we can use them to train people, to skill them, and to release them to the market. But I'm worried, Aldrin, because we tend to look at the issue of the people will say there's corruption also in that program.
Yeah.
In terms of what is happening at local government level, the issues of nepotism. But for me, those are minor issues. They are major, but they are minor. They are minor in that still, even if you say it's nepotism, the people who would be employed would be people who have been unemployed. It's just that because of the magnitude of the challenge, each person is looking at another one who's got the opportunity. Why didn't I have the opportunity? If we could just run that, where the partnerships now come in a manner that says to this community, here is an opportunity amongst yourselves, choose. That's what I've been preaching. Amongst yourselves, you know each other as this community. Choose those families that you know there's nobody, there's nothing to put on the table. And when you run the program in that fashion, then everybody knows why so-and-so is there. They were chosen openly, transparently. That's all we need, is to run them in a transparent manner to deal with the corruption, so-called corruption challenge. For me, the corruption that we very silent about, you know, we gloat around the 2010 projects.
Yeah, the stadia.
But yes, the stadia and all that came with it. But when you look at the amounts that were involved in that kind of corruption, we seem to not be so serious. And that's what worries me, that we tend to mix issues of corruption and handle them in a manner that does not send a clear message that corruption is corruption and we must deal with it as it rears its ugly head. So I do want us to also understand that we tend to make corruption a government issue, when in fact it is companies, private companies, that go in cahoots with public servants where there would be corrupt tendencies in government. And therefore, we need to ensure that we deal with corruption. There's a term about tigers and flies. We just deal with corruption as corruption. And wherever it rears its ugly head, because I always say it takes two to tango in that act of corruption.
Yeah.
There's a public program, there's a private investor or company that goes in cahoots with this public servant. So we need to deal with both of them.
Deputy Minister, is it really an issue of just having, you have the corrupter and the corruptee, or is it about actually an environment that has been created to enable that corruption to thrive? And the points that were made earlier on about how the state, for instance, was hollowed out of its capacity, and how skills, how there was an issue around the skills as well, is because an environment for that had been created, isn't it?
If you look at our laws, nobody finds fault with the laws in terms of that environment that we're talking about. We have laws that govern procurement, for example, and the processes and the systems. And nobody can point there in that law to say, here is a clause that promotes corruption or that allows corruption to thrive. For me, the critical issue is what is termed consequence management.
Yes.
Is that when we find this person, the laws, again, especially for the public servant, they make them to be elusive to consequence management. And that's the drive that we are taking as government to tighten that gap that is there in terms of dealing with corruption. But also, I do want to say, even in private sector, we must encourage private sector to not tolerate it and to stop doing it, to ensure ethical business principles. You know, some companies, I heard the other day from one of my nieces, saying the company that employs her, if you are caught in an unethical business, an unethical business transaction or activity, they have signed to say we don't go through the disciplinary processes, that long thing. You just have to go. They make it so easy for one who has erred to leave. That's what we must do in the public service.
Okay.
We must make it easy to kick out the corrupt elements, because again, you will find that the corrupt elements are few, but because the act in itself is so unacceptable, and we tend to generalize when we talk about it, we find that the whole public service is painted, and government therefore is painted with that bad brush, and we need to stop brushing and to be targeted in our approach in dealing with corruption.
Sure. Dr. Makhetla, just quickly on that particular point, when the president always speaks, he speaks of an ethical state. He speaks, yes, of a capable state, but also that it must be an ethical state at the same time. And just listening into what the Deputy Minister have to say, what's your take on it?
You know, I think if you're saying we're going to assess the state in terms of its ability to serve the people, then those two things are the same. They only diverge if you think somehow you can have, you know, if you think, you know, for instance, that the apartheid state was efficient but unethical. So I think in a democracy, I don't think you can necessarily, I really think you shouldn't separate those things. The part of saying, is it a capable state is it meeting the needs of the constituency of the ruling party? And I would argue that one of the reasons we've been saying that state capture is unethical is because it precisely prevented the state from meeting the needs of the people. Yeah?
Okay, let's go to this question here. I've got a question here from Mpukulo, who says, which sectors or industries can be targeted to achieve that fine balance between state programs galvanizing employment relative to opening up industries for private sector to participate and create sustained employment? Dr. Makhetla, would you like to take that?
Sure. You know, I just think, let's be clear. And I'm not sure I'm completely getting the question, but that if what we're really saying is, if you've been in the private sector, and they say so, I think in the framing for this whole symposium, of course, the private sector has to make money. One of the problems with trying to provide infrastructure for people who can't pay is that you can lose that aspect of accountability. And in that context, so to me, that's the biggest problem, is that to do PPPs for the low income group tends to mean either that you are...
Dr. Makhetla, just quickly hold that point. There's somebody's mic that's on, and there is noise coming in, bleeding through their mics. So please, everyone, just a reminder again, please keep your mics on mute, unless if we are speaking to you. Okay, Dr. Makhetla?
So, yeah, so no, what I was trying to say is that the issue with PPPs is that there's always a risk that if the government is just subsidizing, then the private sector may be tempted to cut corners and provide less cost because the people who are using the infrastructure are not actually, you know, controlling the income stream. And we've seen that most visibly in corrections in the prisons. Yeah? On the other hand, if government doesn't provide a subsidy, they may not get the infrastructure at all. So I think that, to me, that's the critical thing with PPPs. And one of the things with EPWP, and particularly community work programs, is that you're precisely trying to serve the poorest communities where they can't pay. So those may be the hardest ones to get a PPP in. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And there are some things like building schools and things that it might be possible to have at least some labor-intensive elements, where in effect, the PPP takes the form almost of a lease. So the school, basically the private sector builds it and then turns it over to the state, and the state pays for it over a period of time.
Yeah.
But it's actually quite hard for these sort of small-scale, labor-intensive, the kinds of things Miriam was saying about maintenance. Those kinds of projects, it is quite hard, I would argue, to do PPPs. It's much easier where you're supplying something like bulk infrastructure where you know how you're going to pay in terms of either major customers or the taxpayer. Than it is trying to do very, small-scale, localized projects that are better for EPWP and also for community employment schemes.
Are there forms of incentives that you can use to encourage that?
I mean, yes, you can subsidize things. I just think that, we have to take into account we are one of the most unequal countries in the world. And under apartheid, infrastructure was so skewed that the biggest backlogs are precisely in the poorest areas. And to incentivize people to invest there is just difficult because people genuinely cannot pay. And I mean, you can see it if you look at, the malaise affecting many small towns is that they actually get virtually no income from services. And it's not because people aren't paying what they owe, it's because they actually don't owe under the various policies because their household incomes are too low. And I think that makes it just, we're trying to get into a virtuous cycle where we give them the infrastructure that enables them to engage better with the economy, as well as with things like education and healthcare. And that in turn, they become more productive, their incomes go up, over time they can pay. But we have to kickstart it by subsidizing infrastructure. And that's always been one of our hardest challenges around getting infrastructure to the majority of the population.
Because Prof. Bora, the other issue is what Gauteng has been complaining about in terms of the number of people moving into the province as well as migration, and how Gauteng is taking a knock because of that. But then you find the reason that people are moving away from these rural townships is because there's absolutely nothing that's happening there. Hi, Prof.
Sorry, my unmute wasn't working. Yeah, so I think again, if you are going to twin an infrastructure build program to patterns of urbanization, then that's the goal of policy, right? I come back to my point. I think we are too programmatic in the way that we're thinking about let's call it the public employment schemes. We don't seem to have. So the point you're making is if you have a design strategy or policy intervention for which the goal of an infrastructure build program is let's look at patterns of urbanization, and wherever those are the greatest and whichever urban centers, that's where we focus infrastructure build through public employment schemes, and that's fine, right? But your problem is once you add that to poverty relief, to employment creation, and then we've got a little bit of sort of inclusive growth and big bulk infrastructure, and then it's, frankly speaking, it's a mess, right? Because then you've got this diverse set of infrastructure without coherence, and that's what I worry about. I mean, I think urbanization is a really good idea, right? I mean, let me give you another example. If you think one of the key things is to provide infrastructure to support ECD facilities, early childhood development, through to schooling. We know that we have large numbers of Quintile 1 schools that don't have water, that don't have access to all sorts of infrastructure. You could design your public works or community works program specifically with that in mind, sort of a school-based infrastructure program. But that has to have coherence, right? Otherwise, it's spread too thinly, and in fact, it's spread unevenly. And then the kinds of outcomes you get are really unclear from the outset because you haven't designed it properly.
What do you mean by coherence?
So when I say coherence, what you're saying, for instance, myself, Miriam, and Neva were talking about, well, can we not design a public works program that has, and the suggestion was, it doesn't have to be that, has coherence within an inclusive growth trajectory. So if your inclusive growth goals, Miriam mentioned the NDP, have a specific set of criteria, then public works programs need to fit into that, rather than let's do a little bit of this, let's focus on schools,
Okay.
and let's do a little bit of urbanization, and then you lack coherence. So choose your goal, choose the criteria, and go from there.
Yes.
Actually,
Wasn't it Miriam suggested that we decentralize? Okay, sorry, is that Dr. Miriam?
Yeah, can I come in?
Yeah.
So I know it might appear that it's a bit of a fish and chips, but actually the specific areas that, here, I'll put my video on. The specific areas that where EPWP focuses, it really wasn't fish and chips. They were, you know, like ECD 0 to 4. I know that I led enormous amounts of work when I was at HSRC years ago to get focus on some of these areas. We looked at where the main service delivery gaps were and where the overlap could be with EPWP. And these programs align perfectly to what the biggest service delivery gaps are. So, you know, and that in this case is servicing children under age 4. That has probably the biggest development impact that there can be, is a huge job creator, was underserviced. The home-based care, health, I forget what the program's called, but the home community health care. And the CWP ended up being these services. In fact, there was a big overlap. I think initially when Kate Phillip was working on it, she thought there would be a lot of fencing and that kind of thing. But it turned out that a lot of what people applied for were these programs. So then when the deputy minister says, oh, but Dr. Altman, you know, you're wrong. We have actually deployed people to schools. That's a very well considered and designed. I'm very glad to be corrected, because I was actually making the point that this should be a critical service delivery area that could overlap with EPWP very well, and opportunity that's there, that would help to keep the economy going and avoid further lockdowns. I would love to see, as I said, more support to companies, even if it's a roaming, maybe mobile service. You know, as an example, you know, I've been sitting on the Tiger Brands Foundation board since it was started, and we deliver school breakfast. So we work very closely with the National School Nutrition Program and DBE. And we train youth to use mobile applications to take pictures of the food, both ours and the Department of Education's, and report in on a daily basis as to how the program's going. That's exactly the kind of thing that the COVID response should be doing. So we can
unfortunately,
get
Dr. Altman's line there isn't great.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Anyway, I think that this is very well aligned, actually. I don't think it's a random thing at all. I really don't. I think it's actually very well considered and targeted. It just needs to get stronger and expand more, and it's very much part of an inclusive growth strategy. Hello? I'm not sure if I'm off or everybody else is off.
No, I think we've lost our chair.
Okay.
Go again.
Where's we've lost him again. It's his network then. Aldrin.
Poor Aldrin.
Maybe once they are
Let me check, Aldrin.
Maybe this is something that we should work on as a country to make sure that we've got better connection.
Absolutely.
Deputy Minister, there's a question from Sandy Boyer. I'm here. Anyone? Somebody?
Yes, we can hear you.
Deputy Minister, can you hear me?
Can hear you now.
Okay, thank you so much. So as we concluding, here's a question here from Sandy Boyer. Sorry, perhaps I have misunderstood, but what is the content of the future program EPWP? What is the main axis? Is this program articulated with concepts of resilience to climate change?
Let me appreciate that question from our participant and indicate that as the Department of Public Works, we coordinate all departments implementing EPWP. Each department has a stream on which it applies and employs the EPWP program. From my side or from our side, we coordinate those departments and collate the information as to which department is doing what. One example is that on environment, there's working for water, there's working for fire. Is in other departments like health, you have the community health workers. In other departments like education now, we have realized the need and we have initiated working with education, the need for them to have more or less per school about 5 people who must, now that the screening taking place when learners arrive, must screen learners, make a record of who came in, what was the temperature and all that. So they work as a team in each of the schools throughout the country. We have in municipalities, because we also work with municipalities, coordinate them. They have those people who would be cleaning the alien trees, the alien plants. They work with environment, but they also work with municipalities in their parks and those kinds of areas. And I'm therefore kind of saying each department identifies its need, and then they are allocated funds to employ people for EPWP, and all we do is to coordinate their reporting so that we are able to say, in this financial year, this program has produced so many jobs. That's our primary responsibility. But also, because we are a Department of Public Works, we also have our own programs as a Department of Public Works, wherein we then employ these people. And these are the ones I am saying. We will partner with the skilled and youth entrants in the job market, together with experienced retired specialists in the field of the built environment. We will work with communities and local government in the built environment for them to maintain, first and foremost, our existing buildings and infrastructure that's already there. But more than that, to ensure that some of the projects, like your road walkways along the streets, those small projects we utilize to ensure that we skill people, the unskilled labor, so that when they leave the job, the project, they are easily acceptable in the job market. So it's it's an in-transit kind of program, because you come in, you go out. It's not like you are employed here as EPWP.
Sure.
There's an
Deputy
entry
Minister,
and an exit.
on that, are you able as the department to track down what happened to somebody who have gone through this particular program?
Yes, we are.
You are able to do
In
that?
actual fact, we had at the beginning of this year, we had a symposium type where we called in the NPOs we work with and leadership that works with EPWP, because we wanted to ensure that they now understand that we would want to track each and every person who comes into the program, and therefore recording of that kind of detail and ensuring that we build a case for EPWP. We must be able at some point to say we were able to take into EPWP in Department X so many people, and of those, so many are in the job market already.
Yeah, the formal job market. Okay, we're going to get closing remarks. Unfortunately, a minute each, please. Only have like 8 minutes left here. Let's start off with Dr. Makgetla again.
Yeah, so I just want to say I'm grateful for everybody's comments. I thought it was very interesting. I do think that what comes out of this is how difficult it is to talk about transformatory infrastructure, and how important it is, as I think Haroon said, to come up with a programmatic approach that says very consistently, how do we ensure that as we do this build program, we actually transform the economy to make it more equitable, more inclusive, more like the society we all want to live in. Thanks.
Okay, thank you much, Dr. Makgetla. Balin.
Thanks to the panelists and facilitator. My take really is that we will be failing the people of South Africa, and we will be failing the constitution which we have committed itself. If you look at chapter 2, the dignity of each and every person who's living in the country. So unemployment takes away that dignity. We need to restore people's dignity. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bora.
Thanks. Just 4 points in conclusion. I think original point, we need to figure out where and WP's into inclusive growth tree and be very specific about it. We have to be clear, secondly, about converting work opportunities into long-term employment outcomes and how do we build that bridge. Thirdly, we have to take the problem of leakages or rent seeking or corruption and to take that seriously. And I think the only way to take it seriously and to set it up, that you have consistent.
Okay, Professor Bora, we lost you there for a sec. Is Professor Bora still there? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Sure, we can hear you now. You can go ahead.
So again, I was just saying, four points for me really is figure out where you fit with the skills development is key there. I agree with the Deputy Minister, but we have to keep an eye on it in terms of rent-seeking opportunities.
Yeah.
Finally, one way to keep an eye on it, but also to monitor, to sort of keep a clear sense of the direction we're taking with public works programs to have an appropriate monitoring evaluation system.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much for that, Prof. And Dr. Altman, You get the opportunity to sweep.
I would agree with everything that Harun said just now, so I won't repeat it. And I think that the biggest opportunity within this is in the area of social services and in greater cooperation. It's not just with the private sector, but with the strengthening of community-based organizations and nonprofits through innovative approaches like social franchising, as an example. So getting that capacity in place. And then just in closing, if I can just remind people that the NPC has just issued papers on strengthening infrastructure delivery and on state-owned enterprise. And it may not have been the main topic of today, but I do hope that people will share them and will have a look and give us feedback, including to our friends in government. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Deputy Minister, your turn. Thank you so much for this as well, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Aldrin. Thanks to you first. I think you were a very good facilitator and chairperson. I do understand the need for us to beef up our communication infrastructure, especially that we've been losing you so many times. But it's not of your making, it's the system. To also thank the panelists. I think they took their task very seriously and have really raised thought-provoking ideas which will help us as government to restructure and enhance the programs we're driving. But indeed, the words that I used initially, this is for all of us. It's a duty we have accepted in the Constitution when we said we will work to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. When we were saying so, it meant everybody must be productive where they are to the best they could be. And therefore, that talks truly to employment creation. We will continue to work with communities, with leadership in private sector. We really do need those partnerships, public-private partnerships, but working, of course, with our NPOs. And currently, in fact, our EPWP program is driven by NPOs. We contract NPOs and they roll it on the ground. Mine is to thank everyone who have participated, even those who are connected elsewhere, who have been writing comments. We take note of those comments, and as we move along, we will work to improve. Ours is to ensure that employment is part of inclusive growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. From me, Aldrin Simpier, the rest of the team, Abo Buitumelo, who are working behind the scenes, and Nombulelo as well, putting this together. Really appreciate it and appreciate your time and all the contributions as well. And a great pleasure speaking to the panelists that we have today. And Minister, like you said, let's make sure that everyone becomes productive. Goodbye, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aldrin. Bye. Thank you.
Ciao.
Thanks, Mr. Valeni. Yeah. So